All right, 1 Samuel chapter 31. Today we are going to finish 1 Samuel. I've been promising that for weeks, but today we're going to finish. 1 Samuel chapter 31. This is the, interestingly, I read, and you've read this before too, that originally 1 and 2 Samuel were in the part of the same book. In fact, there was more books belonging to it, but it's interesting here that the break takes place with the death of Saul, which really is a significant spot. I don't know if you have it marked, but just for reference purposes, Saul dies in approximately the year 1010 BC, 1010 BC, which is significant to our timeline. I don't know if I have it written up there, but I will. Again, that's a date that's going to be on the final exam as well. 1 Samuel chapter 31. Jack, you want to start reading for us?
Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa.
Pause right there just a second. All right, where are we? Here's our map. I don't know how well you can see it. This is Israel. The Philistines are from this area right here. It's lower southwest Israel, which is now the Gaza Strip, still inhabited by the Philistines, who call themselves the Palestinians. Where this battle is taking place is up here at Mount Gilboa. It's not shown on this map, but it's in the Jezreel Valley, and it's generally in this area. So the Philistines have really moved north. They have kind of swarmed, and they meet Saul in this area right here. We're going to see that Saul's body was taken to a place called Beth-shan, which is right here, sort of at the intersection of the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan River Valley, just south of the Sea of Galilee. And again, for reference, we have Beth-shan shown in the photograph on the very bottom, the second column from the left. That's the ancient city of Beth-shan. Okay, read on.
Where am I? Okay. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers took over him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on the sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all the men died together in the same way.
All right, pause right there. That's significant. Here we have the historical account of Saul's death and what happened. They're in the heat of battle. He's on Mount Gilboa. He's been hit by arrows from the Philistines. He doesn't want the Philistines to fall upon him and torture him or make sport of him, so he calls on his armor-bearer to kill him. The armor-bearer refuses, and so what happens?
Saul killed his
Saul falls on his sword, and it says very clearly here in a couple of places that Saul died. Saul died along with his sons, and the reason that's significant, we're going to see in the next book that there's a different story told about that. We're going to analyze that. All right, read on.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
In my footnote, and I'm really confused, it says, although not condemned, suicide is rare in the Bible, and there's no stigma associated with it. I'm confused about today, suicide is a sin. So, if it's not in the Bible that I can find, why is it sinful? Am I missing something?
Well, I think it is in the Bible. And it is, suicide is rare, it's rare these days, relatively speaking. It's rare back then. But I think it still falls under the edict, thou shalt not kill. We shouldn't kill anybody else. We shouldn't kill ourselves. Why? Because life is sacred. All life is sacred.
Yeah, and I get that, but I'm just like, I don't know, I'm just kind of confused on that.
Yeah. Well,
And another thing he brings up in here too is about cremation.
yeah,
They cremated Saul.
they did. They did. And I don't find anything in the scripture that condemns cremation. A lot of people were cremated, perhaps against their will. We know that happened. Some of them, perhaps they desire to be cremated, but I don't find anything in the scripture that says that it's good or bad, scriptural or unscriptural to be cremated. So, I think at the end, God's going to figure out a way to put us all back together again, whether we've been cremated or whether we're buried and the worms eat us, whatever happens.
Well, I mean, it says in Genesis, we're just dust,
That's right.
so.
Yep, from dust we came and to dust we shall return.
I have a question about verse 6.
Verse 6, what's your question?
And all his men died together in the same way. So all those guys who were following in Saul's little group, they all did themselves in?
Yours says in the same way or on the same day?
I'm sorry. Same day.
On the same day.
So,
They wiped them all out that same day. I don't think they all committed suicide. It doesn't say that Jonathan committed suicide. I think Jonathan was killed, the other sons were
Right.
killed. Saul was wounded, he didn't die, but he saw the enemy was closing in on him, and so,
But he's critically wounded, which means he
Yeah.
probably would die.
right.
and his
Within
troops, and his troops wouldn't have been able to fight their way out, right?
Right.
Is that what
It
he
was,
does?
they were trapped like rats, as the
Okay.
saying goes. Yeah.
Got it.
All right, read on.
When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled, and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor. And they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashereths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days.
So that's the end of Saul, 1010 BC. All right, now we transition into the book of 2 Samuel here, which is a continuation of the story. The only logical break is that Saul is now dead, so we're moving into kind of a new era, certainly a new era of David's life. He is no longer going to be pursued by Saul, but we see at this point in time that his troubles are not fully over. And what we see from this is, as we discussed before, Saul was constantly after David, and the story of the clash between Saul and David is the story of a clash between the flesh and the spirit. David, being led by the spirit, is constantly being pursued by the flesh, and even though Saul repented many times of his efforts to kill David, he recognized he was wrong. He recognized that David had the opportunity to kill him but never did. Saul repented and said, oh, you're innocent, I'm guilty, I shouldn't do it, I love you as my own son, I'm never going to do it again. But he did, he continued to pursue it. Meaning what? You can never trust the flesh and the promises of the flesh. The flesh is constantly pursuing and trying to undo the works of the Spirit. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 1. Brother Kenny, you want to start reading for us?
After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days.
All right, pause right there. Where's Ziklag? Anybody remember? Ziklag is way back down here. So Ziklag is what's sometimes referred to as a border town. Remember that David went and he spent 16 months living with the Philistines, someplace where I think God didn't want him to be. But when he finally was rebuffed by the Philistines and left, he didn't really go back to his people. He stayed in a border town, Ziklag, which is right in this area down here. Okay. So anyway, that's where he is when he gets the news of Saul's death. Read on.
On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. Where have you come from? David asked him. He answered, I have escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? David asked. Tell me. He said, the men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?
All right, pause right there. Up to this point in time, this young Amalekite, he's told him the truth. He says, Saul's dead, And Jonathan's dead. He says, I've come from the battle and I've seen it. And so David inquires, how do you know that? And then what we have here is a story that's inconsistent with what we just read at the end of 1 Samuel. And I want us to think about which is correct, which is incorrect, and if there's an incorrect story, who's telling the incorrect story. So read on.
I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? He asked me, who are you? The Amalekite, I answered. Then he said to me, stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive. So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and had brought them here to my Lord.
All right, pause right there. That story is inconsistent with what we just read at the end of 1 Samuel. What's inconsistent about
He
it?
fell on his sword,
Yeah,
not a spear.
yeah,
Started off with it.
yeah. You know, I read in Josephus. You know, Josephus was an ancient historian. He wrote about this, and one of the things that Josephus did a lot of writing, but one of the things he wrote was a history of the nation of Israel. And you can tell that he picked up on a lot of what was written in the scriptures, but he also picked up on some other books. And Josephus reconciles the two accounts, and what Josephus says when he tells the story of the history of Israel, he said he reconciles them by saying, yeah, Saul was he was shot by the arrows. He realized that he was going to be captured, so he fell on his sword. But when he fell on his sword, didn't kill himself completely, and so this Amalekite comes along and he begs the Amalekite to kill him, and he does. And that is a reconciliation, but it's inconsistent with what we see over here in chapter 21. And so you wonder, well, if Saul really didn't kill himself, why does it say here several times that he died? And why is there no reference of this young Amalekite at the end of chapter 31? Who's got a thought about that?
And would Saul been wearing the crown? Seemed like he had his armor on.
Yeah. Well, evidently this young man brings the crown and the bracelet, so he got it somewhere.
That's
Amalekites scavengers, and he just came upon the corpse and brought it to David hoping for reward.
See, that's what I'm thinking. I think this young Amalekite, that he just made up the story, all right? He knew enough about what was going on in Israel to know that David was the heir apparent, right? And so he knew that David was the guy who was going to come to power. So he's looking for a way that he can ingratiate himself to David. And he's looking, as you say, he's looking for a favor. So he gets the crown and he gets the bracelet and he's going to take it to David. So, but then, you know, why did he just say, hey, I found this and you're the rightful king, so I'm bringing it to you? Why did he embellish it by saying, oh, and by the way, I killed Saul?
He thought Saul was his enemy.
I think so. I think everybody knew that Saul was crazy and that Saul had been pursuing David and wanted to kill him. So I think the Amalekite might have thought, hey, you know, David, he's going to be happy to know that this guy who's been pursuing him for probably 15 years is dead. And so he embellished the story that way. That's my personal belief. It could be that what the Amalekite was saying was true. I don't think so. I tend to believe that what's reported at the end of 1 Samuel is true. The Amalekite is just making up a story, as Nancy said, to ingratiate himself to David, hoping for some sort of a favor from David, who's gonna
Well, wasn't
Inherit
Saul
the crown.
supposed to kill all the Amalekites, and he didn't?
He
Am I
was.
remembering correctly?
He was. He absolutely was. So that's kind of an interesting twist too. That was over in the very beginning.
Where's this somewhere back there? 1:15, wasn't it? 1:15, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, well, let's find that because that's in chapter 15. That's right. God told him to go and utterly destroy Amalek, for the Amalekites, of course, and all their people, and Saul didn't do it. And that was the reason why God removed his favor. So that's kind of an interesting twist that Nancy brings up. So it turns out at the end that Amalekite is claiming credit for having killed Saul. All right. Kathy, you want to pick up from there?
Okay.
Is there a reason why Saul didn't kill all of them?
Yeah.
Give
He
them
wanted the
reason?
best of everything.
Yeah. Remember what Saul did is what didn't he do? He basically killed the army, but he brought back their king. He brought back Agag. When God clearly commanded that Agag be killed. And why did he bring Agag back? Why did he bring the king back?
Look what I've done.
As a trophy. That's right. You know, Saul wanted to claim the credit for a victory that God gave him, which, you know, shows how his flesh continued to shine through. When God allowed Saul to be anointed as king, the scripture says that Saul was a changed man, and there was a time that he too was a man after God's heart, but he quickly changed his ways. He was no longer led by the Spirit. That account in chapter 15 shows that he is very fleshly. He brought back the king as a trophy to show everyone, look what I did. You know, I defeated everybody. I brought the king back, and he's now my lapdog. He also brought back the spoils, right? He brought back the best of the sheep and the cattle and whatever. Why? Fattened up his pocketbook, right? Strictly greed. But so he was disobedient to God, and because of that, he was cursed by God.
His disobedience killed him.
Exactly right.
He didn't learn from history,
Nope.
because that was their trouble over time. God told them
Yeah.
to wipe them out, and they would do the same thing.
Yeah. Well, of course, you know, as we know, God told Joshua and the group of Israelites who came out of the wilderness. They crossed the Jordan. God said to do what? Wipe out everybody.
Yep.
And we learned in Joshua they didn't do that. They were lazy. They were fearful for whatever reason. They didn't wipe everybody out, and the ones that they didn't wipe out became a thorn in their flesh, and they were a thorn in their flesh. I mean, you look at the Philistines; they're a thorn in the flesh to this very day. You know, some of the folks that were not wiped out back then continue to be a plague on the nation of Israel. So as you say, the curse of disobedience. You know, when God tells you to do something, you better do it. If you don't, you better watch out, because
Well, that's when the Battle of Armageddon, everybody's going to be looking, and you know, God is the one that's going to wipe them all out for sure.
that's right. That's right. All right, Nancy, you want to read?
Where are we at, 11?
We are in, verse 11.
Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who had reported to him, "Where do you come from?" He answered, "I am the son of a resident alien, an Amalekite." David said to him, "Were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Come here and strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed."
All right, pause right there. If this young guy hadn't really killed the king, if he was just running his mouth, if he was just bragging, did he deserve to die for it? What did David perceive to be this young Amalekite's real sin?
Killed him.
He killed Saul.
That he killed Saul. He says, and David, he looks at this guy, and it's like he can't even believe. He says, "Don't you see anything wrong with lifting up your hand against the Lord's anointed?" And I think in David's mind, whether he killed him or not, perhaps was immaterial. It was the fact that this young man saw nothing wrong with lifting up his hand against the Lord's anointed, and that was the real sin that David is striking back against. Because, you know, David lived under that edict all of his life. He had, as we said before, many opportunities to kill Saul. Remember, in the cave, and then they snuck into the camp, and he took the jug and the spear that's right by Saul's head. And David was encouraged by his own men to kill this guy. This guy has, he's been after you. Kill him. This is your opportunity. This is an opportunity that God has given to you to finally kill this guy who's after you. David said, "I can't do it. I cannot lift up my hand against against the Lord's anointed. In other words, what David knew was that God had a plan in Saul's life. And even though Saul was constantly after David's life, David saw God's great plan. That there was a plan, there was a benefit to David and to us by Saul's pursuit of David. Right? And what was that? What is the benefit that we get from Saul's pursuit of David?
Seek the flesh.
Well, we get the lesson, but we also know that when David was fearful of Saul, what did he do? He took pen in hand, he wrote some beautiful psalms. You know, there are many psalms that David wrote, which through David's writing teach us how to praise God and how to worship God and how to submit our lives to God's authority. So there's a great benefit in that. David saw that. He had tremendous wisdom.
What a great example, though, that David always trusted the Lord
Yeah.
to take care of what the situation was.
Yeah.
Where we today, what a great example to us, we'll give God so much trust, and then we think we don't need to handle it anymore.
That's right.
And even though, sure, I want Saul dead. Most of the people around probably, he's not good.
Yeah.
Get rid of him. But yet, David showed us in trusting in the Lord, there's something better.
That's right. That's right. And each one of us has a Saul in our own lives. We either had it in the past, we have it in the present, or we're going to have it in the future. That there's going to be a Saul. There's going to be something in our lives that makes us uncomfortable or even miserable. Something that if we had it within our power, we would put an end to it, right? But we should have, as Kathy said, we should have the same attitude that David had, and that is, God put it here, let God deal with it. God is trying to teach me something because of this Saul in my life. I want this Saul out of my life right now. I want it out yesterday, but no, God's will is what should be
And
done.
even with our nighttime study with Goliath and David,
Yeah.
we've always put ourselves in David's position instead of Jesus in
Right.
David's position. And
That's right.
what an eye-opener that has been, that God took care of it.
Yeah. As David said, the battle is the Lord's, not mine. So, yep. Powerful lessons there. Powerful lessons there. All right.
And our
Where's-
hardest thing is waiting, waiting on the Lord.
Yeah. Boy, isn't that right?
I'm
Waiting.
speaking for myself.
Yeah. I mean, that doesn't apply to me, obviously. But yeah, waiting on the Lord, that's something we all need to learn. Okay, verse 17. Jonathan, you want to read or pass? You want to read for us?
I have KJV, so.
That's fine.
Okay. And David lamented and with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Also he bade them to teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jeshir.
All right, pause right there. I looked this up about this book of Jeshar, and really all this was, as best I could tell, it's sort of like an account of the heroes. And so David had the story of Saul and Jonathan, basically their names written in the book of heroes, and then he gives this lament. He basically sings a song. He gives a eulogy about their lives, and you can see here that even though Saul was slap crazy and Saul was trying to kill David, still in death, David lifts him up, recognizing that Saul was placed in his life by God's providence, and David honors that. So read on, verse 19.
The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, push it not in the streets of
Ashkelon.
Ascalon.
Part of that. Gath and Ashkelon are two cities of the Philistines, of course. And he says, don't tell the story of the death of Saul and Jonathan in those places, lest they do what? Lest they cheer. Read on.
Lest the daughters of the Philistine rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, nor let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offering, for the shield of the mighty is vainly cast away, the shield of Saul. as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul not returned empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant with their lives, and in their deaths they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet, other delights, who put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in this battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love unto me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished?
All right, Paul's right there. You know, we see here that David is singing a song. He's lifting up the lives of Saul and Jonathan. Now, truly, Jonathan was a virtuous man. Jonathan and David were like brothers. I believe that David truly loved Jonathan. I think Jonathan loved David. So you can see why he would lament the death of Jonathan. But Saul, for Saul, he should have said, Saul, this is the crazy lunatic who's been trying to kill me, and I'm glad he's dead. That's probably what most of us would have done. But David didn't do that. He said, no, he was a great man. He did great things for Israel. And he says, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life. Well, wasn't so pleasant for David. And in their death they were not parted, swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. So he lifts them up. And why does he do that? Because he knew that God had placed Saul on the throne of Israel, the throne of, his chosen people, for a specific purpose, for a specific time, and David was giving full honor to that. He was not going to do anything to undercut God's plan for Israel or for Saul. And it's interesting here, in verse 21 it says, O mountains of Gilboa, let not dew or rain be on you, nor fields of offering. And it's interesting, when we went to Israel, we drove by Mount Gilboa, and our guide said, you look up there, and you'll see a spot on Mount Gilboa that's brown, even to this day. And he says grass doesn't grow there. It's said that rain doesn't fall, that dew doesn't grow there. But I mean, whether it's just that it's rocky soil or whatever, there's still a spot on Mount Gilboa that grass doesn't grow. Interesting. Could be because of David's curse here. All right. Now, where are we? Here's something I wanted us to see.
Before we go on, isn't it wonderful that David still remembers the good things that Saul? Yeah. We today we're quick to remember the bad things and not the good things someone did for us. Yeah. And yet David continually remembers that Saul took him in when he was just, young. Yeah.
That's a great point that Kathy makes. And hopefully we can all have that attitude. When in our rear view mirror, when Saul's in our rear view mirror, when we've gone through all that trial and that turmoil and that pain and that anguish with something that's come into our life, whether it's a person or whether it's a sickness or whether it's something else, if we can have the same kind of peace and say, God, it was your plan, and I'm glad that you did all these things for me. That takes a lot of spiritual wisdom to be able to do that, but hopefully we will someday. All right, these are some names we're going to see in our next reading, and I want to introduce you to them and so you can kind of organize in your mind where they are. Saul had a son named Jonathan, we all know. Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, and we're going to read about him. What do you remember about Mephibosheth? Crippled. How did he get crippled?
His nurse was running with him and fell.
Yeah. Why was the nurse running?
Because she was afraid that David would.
Yeah, she'd heard about Jonathan's death, I think is what it was. And so Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, he's dropped, he has crippled feet. So we're going to talk about him. Saul had another son by the name of Ishbosheth, and we're going to talk about him, who ascends the throne. Saul also had a general whose name was Abner. We're going to read about him. He's a significant guy. We're also going to read about David, who his father was Jesse. Jesse also had 6 other sons, right? And some other sons. Jesse also had a daughter whose name was Zeruiah. Zeruiah. We're going to read about her. And Zeruiah had 3 sons, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. And so these guys that we're going to read about, Joab becomes a general to David. And so we see here that Joab would have been David's what? Nephew, that's right. So those are some characters. I just wanted to get you the lay of the land, so to speak, as we start talking about it. All right, who's our next reader? Ken, you want to read?
Okay.
Pass, Terry? Chapter 2.
In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" He asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered.
Pause right there. This is very significant too. We see this many times about David, which distinguished him from Saul and some other leaders. It says, David inquired of the Lord, basically saying, "Lord, I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do now." And when he asked him, the Lord answered him. And when David was obedient, things went well with him. Read on.
So David went up there with his 2 wives, and Noam and Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah.
Pause right there. All right, so Kenny asked a question. Someone, who is that guy who anointed David? Well, in truth, the scripture records that he was anointed 3 times. The first time he was anointed by whom? By Samuel, that's right. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 19. He's anointed the second time by whom? By the men of Judah. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 4. He was also anointed a 3rd time. And if you look over in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 3, it says, "So the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel." So, maybe on a game show, that'll win you $1 million sometimes. How many times was David anointed? 3 times.
His hair must have been oily, huh?
Yeah. I bet that's right. Okay, read on.
When David was told that it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing his kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, the strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them."
Verse 8, here comes Abner.
Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim.
Yeah.
He made him king over Gilead of Assyria and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David.
All right, pause right there just a second. All right, so here we have Ishbosheth. He becomes the king over Israel. He's one of those forgotten kings, sort of the same way that Abimelech, remember Gideon's son Abimelech? He was named as a king over Israel. That's in Judges chapter 9, verses 6 and verse 22. So again, just for your footnotes of history, we have this circumstance just like we had Abimelech, where Ishbosheth becomes king over Israel for some period of time. All right, read on, verse 11.
I'll tell you one thing, chapter 2 here, it's got a lot in it for a person to understand.
A lot of stuff, a lot of history in it. Huh?
I think, I'd take a quick pop quiz like this here.
Hey, it could happen. All I can say is be prepared.
Those 2 guys were not anointed by God.
What's that?
Ishbosheth and what was that?
Abimelech.
Abimelech.
No, that's true.
So that makes a big difference.
It does make a difference, but it's significant though that the scripture says, you think, well, I've never heard that Abimelech was king. Well, the scripture clearly says, 2 places, yes, he was the king over Israel. Same way here, it says Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. So he was a king of Israel. In between Saul, of course, and David had already been anointed, but he is just another king who's there at the time. All right.
That was a different party.
Is that different political party? Yeah.
Well, that was technically the first divided kingdom before
Right.
divided, because it was saying it was Judah versus Israel.
Yeah. And that, yeah, Robert's right, because we know after the death of Solomon, we have formally the divided kingdom, right? We have Israel in the north and Judah in the south, but it was divided. I mean, you could say that at the time that Samuel anointed David, that began the divided kingdom, right? Because you had Saul who had been anointed and appointed as king, and then you had David who was anointed, and then Saul finally dies, and they go, all right, well now we're united again, but no, Ishbosheth steps up and he's anointed, so yeah, we still are in that divided kingdom. All right, read on.
The length of time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months.
Okay, that's a significant point too, because we know that David, his total rule is how many years? He was 40 years. Easy to remember, Saul ruled for 40 years, David ruled for 40 years, Solomon ruled for 40 years. 100 years of the so-called united kingdom. Before, after the death of Solomon, you had the divided kingdom. You had a list of kings in the north and a list of kings in the south. But these 3 kings ruled for 120 years, 40 years each. David, it tells us here that his headquarters was in Hebron for about 7 years, and then after that, where was his headquarters? Jerusalem. Yeah, remember he captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and he built a city there, and so he was there for another 33 years.
So that's 7.5 years. Okay, that's included in the 40?
Yeah. So
Okay.
7 years, one place, and then another 33 years, possibly in Jerusalem. Yeah. Okay, Civil War. Who's reading next? Kim, you want to read?
Yeah.
Verse 12.
Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gilgal. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out with them at the pool of Gibeah. One group sat down on one side of the pool, and one group on the other side. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David.
All right, pause right there. So what do we have right here? We have these 2 generals who are getting together, Abner and Joab, and it's kind of a chest bump type of a situation. Who's the toughest here? And you got these armies lined up, and one of them says, "Well, you give me your 12 best, and I'll put up my 12 best, and let's just see what they do." I don't think it was like a David and Goliath type of a situation. It was like they were going to just, fight it out. It's not as if one was going to surrender, but they said, let's just see what happens. And what happened, I don't think anybody expected. Read on.
Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazarim. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's men.
Pause right there just a second. All right, so the 12, they face off against each other. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but what it sounded like to me is that each one of them had a dagger, each one of them grabbed the other guy's head, and simultaneously, all 24 of them pulled out their dagger and stuck it into their opponent's belly, and all 24 of them died right there. Does anybody read that any other way?
No, it's what mine say.
That's what it sounds like to me. So You got to think that at this point in time that Abner and Joab are kind of looking at each other saying, what? That's not really the way we intended for this to turn out. But anyway, so they fought, and at this point in time, there's a battle afterwards, and David's army was prevailing over Ishbosheth's army. All right, Robert, you can pick up from there.
3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Ashiel. Ashiel, who was as fleet of foot as a gazelle in the open field, set out after Abner, turning neither left nor right in his pursuit. Abner turned around and said, "Is that you, Ashiel?" He replied, "Yes." Abner said to him, "Turn right or left, seize one of the young men, and take what you can strip from him." But he would not stop pursuing him. Once more Abner said to Ashiel, "Stop pursuing me. Why must I strike you to the ground? How could I show my face to your brother Joab?" Still he refused to stop. So Abner struck him in the abdomen with the heel of the spear, and the weapon protruded from his back. He fell there and died on the spot. All who came to the place where Ashiel had fallen and died halted.
All right, pause right there. It doesn't appear that Abner really wanted to kill him. It's like he tells him, leave me alone. Just go on about your business. Just leave me alone. But he kept following. So what does he do? He takes, Abner's got his spear in his hand. He doesn't give him the business end of it to run him through. He just kind of, like he's gonna butt him. Just get off my tail if you would. But he does, and what happens? Runs him through and kills him. Was that an accident? Was it intentional? I think Abner intended to hit him. I don't know if he intended to kill him, but he was. He's dead. So, and who is this guy who gets killed?
David's nephew.
Yeah, one of David's nephews. All right, one of the 3 brothers. All right, read on.
But Joab and Abishai continued the pursuit of Abner. The sun had gone down, and they came to the hill of Ammah, which lies east of the valley toward the wilderness of Geba. Here the Benjamites rallied around Abner, forming a single group to make a stand on the hilltop. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Must the sword devour forever? Do you not know that afterward there will be bitterness? How long before you tell the people to stop pursuing their brothers?" Joab replied, "As God lives, if you had not spoken, it would be morning before the people would be stopped from pursuing their brothers." Joab then sounded the horn, and all the people came to a halt, pursuing Israel no farther and fighting no more.
Right. Pause right there. What's going on is this is really civil war, isn't it? I mean, Saul's group are basically the Benjamites with a few more. Okay? David's group is pretty much everybody else. I mean, not exactly, but truly civil war is going on, and brothers are killing brothers. Israelites are killing Israelites. And Abner, for one, stands up and says, we really shouldn't continue to do this. But we're going to see that the pursuit continues, and we're going to see that on David's side, David and his nephews are continuing to pursue and to completely wipe out all of the remnants of Saul, okay? His son, as well as his general. And it's interesting here, you think, why couldn't they just call a truce and call it, let Abner live, let Ishbosheth live somewhere in peace, let him have some government job somewhere, but don't kill him off. But I think the idea here is that what's going on? Well, this again is the conflict between the flesh and the spirit, being led by the spirit, being led by the flesh. And what David's group is doing is spiritually the right thing, is totally soundly defeating and getting rid of all the remnants of the leadership of the flesh. Because that's the only way that you can truly be in right standing with God, is to be led by the Spirit and not be influenced by your flesh.
Did he offer to step down as king?
Who, Ishbosheth?
Mm-hmm.
Never did.
I guess that was the question also. It's not like he ever...
No.
Because to have done it without him abdicating, then you would have still had the split kingdom.
That's right.
That much earlier.
That's right. All right, read on.
Abner turned around and said, no, sorry, wrong spot. Okay. Abner and his men marched all night through the Arabah toward the Jordan, marched all through the morning and came to Mahanaim. Joab, coming from the pursuit of Abner, assembled all the men. 19 other servants of David were missing besides Asahel. But David's servants had struck down and killed 360 men of Benjamin, followers of Abner.
All right, pause right there. So here we have a body count. 19 of David's servants died, and I suspect 12 of them were in that original scuffle, but only 7 more after that. But on the other side, on the Benjamite side, on Abner's side, how many died? 360. So it was a pretty decisive victory. Read on.
They took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb in Bethlehem. Joab and his men made an all-night march, and dawn found them in Hebron.
Okay, pause right there. Time to stop, Coach? All right. Next time we'll pick up in chapter 3. Any other comments or questions about this? We covered a lot of history there, but we got a pretty good idea of what's going on here in Israel. Still a time of turmoil, still a time of civil war, still some scores, if you will, to be settled.